I'm going to tell you about some of the work that's happening in my laboratory, Laboratory of Brain and Cognition. So as Wendy mentioned, I do neuroscience. This is a photograph of a human brain on the left lateral surface, which would be about here. If I were to remove the side of my head and skull and meninges, you'd see something that looks like this. As far as we know, this is one of the most organized pieces of matter in the universe as we understand it, and we understand very little of it, actually. In part because we can't really take a piece of someone's head off and really dig in and see what's happening very well, especially in healthy adults. We can do that in some cases with those with epilepsy, but those are rare. So instead, what we do is we take pictures of the brain using a magnetic resonance imaging scanner. And so rather than actually getting at the tissue, we get at digital renderings of the brain. So this gives us a sense of the gray matter structure of the cortex, again, on the left lateral surface. And sometimes we're interested in getting into those folds and digging in a little bit deeper. So what we can do is sort of just expand that out a little bit so we can see within some of the crevices. So here we have a better view of the insula and parts of the superior temporal sulcus. So we can't really look inside these sulci as well unless we expand the brain out. And in fact, digitally, we can do this even more, and we can fully inflate the brain like it's some sort of balloon. And in fact, we can unpeel it. And because the cortex is actually a single sheet, it's a single continuous piece of tissue, at least for each hemisphere. And if you were to really unfold a true brain, what would it come out to be is about 1 square meter, approximately 1 to 2 millimeters thick. So mathematically, what we're able to do with computational neuroscience is really unfold the cortex and look at how these cells and how this tissue is functioning. So for today, we're going to fold things back together a little bit, but allow the brain to be expanded somewhat so we have a rough sense of where things are. So here we have the frontal lobe. Here's occipital cortex, the temporal lobe. You may be familiar. This is some motor cortex here. All right, so this is a decent structural rendering of an average brain that you would get. This is an average of about 12 brains, actually. But what I think gets really exciting is when we look at the brain in action. So what we can do is when we have people in the scanner, we can do what's called functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this is where we're looking at the flow of oxygen in the brain. So essentially, the blood oxygen level dependent signal is we have blood flowing through the brain, and it's carrying oxygen, and it's replacing the used oxygen in very active cells. So when neurons are firing quite a bit, they need to be replenished with blood and nutrients and oxygen. And so over time, we can track the flow of blood through cortex, and this gives us an indirect measure of what parts of the brain are active. There's a really large field referred to as cognitive neuroscience, and this field is, what they do is they have subjects perform a number of different kinds of tasks in the scanner. And then statistically, what they can do is model the changes in bold signal that occur over time, and then you can infer what regions of the brain are engaged during that task. That's an enormous field of cognitive neuroscience, but I'm not actually going to go into it. I'm going to talk about the resting oscillations of human cortex. So what's really quite remarkable is that if you have someone, I mean, how you are right now, somebody laying in a scanner, someone just sitting quietly and resting, the brain has these spontaneous oscillations that are constantly unfolding and cascading across all of cortex. And there is a very low frequency sort of oscillation. And if you watch this graphic over time, what you might start to notice is that some of the same regions are becoming gold at the same time or going into blue at the same time. So what seems to be happening is that there's some sort of structure in these spontaneous and what we thought was just random oscillations in the human brain. And in fact, when we look statistically at the patterns of these activity, we can actually reveal a tremendous amount about the brain. For example, if we look at the patterns of co-activation, we can see that there are a number of large-scale brain systems where some regions are more active together than not. And you might notice in this rendering that This is the medial surface of the brain. So this is if you were to go in the middle and peel it open. Because we're just looking at cortex and not the subcortical structures, there's a bit of a hole in here. This is because they have a nucleated structure of the amygdala, the thalamus, the putamen. These don't have the same rules of cortex, so they're not a single mantle. So for this sake, we just leave a hole in there. Anyhow, so what we can see is the spontaneous oscillations of bold signal that unfold over time reveal these large-scale functional systems. And in fact, there are a number of large-scale functional networks in the human brain. There are 10 of them depicted here. The first one I showed you, this is the left lateral surface, the left medial, the right medial, and the right lateral surface. These 10 networks have a number of, basically are conveying a number of different functional ensembles in the brain. There are a number of different ways in which the brain is communicating with itself. And statistically, we're able to estimate what the spatial relationships are from these spontaneous oscillations. So this is all very interesting and colorful and pretty, but what makes me a psychologist is I'm wondering, how does this relate to behavior? Like, why is this meaningful in terms of how these subjects live in the real world and for what they're doing? So in order to do this, what we do is we look at individual differences in behavior. And we can measure this in a number of different ways. So one of them is examining various cognitive abilities, such as reasoning skills. One way that this is assessed is through a task that's called Raven's progressive matrices. Here, participants are given a series of patterns, and they're asked to determine, OK, what comes next? And we can look at the amount of time it takes to choose from this array what the correct solution is. Before arriving upon an answer. How many of you know what the next one is? All right, a few. Trickling in. So when I looked at this a few days ago, I was like, well, these don't really look like each other, but they all have X's, and these all have squares, and these are circles, so it's got to be a circle. And then there's not a lot of relationships across, but there seemed like there's this between relationship, and eventually found that this was the correct answer. So this is one method by which psychologists are able to estimate how people's reasoning ability. And this is one domain. There are a number of different domains in cognitive psychology that relate to memory or attention. Additionally, there's another field that looks at various aspects of people's personality or their attitudes that they carry as they walk around the world. And these kinds of measures are somewhat different. They're not performance-based measures in that there's not an objectively true answer, but they also capture another aspect of who we are. So for example, one question that we might give our research subjects is, like, how much would you endorse this statement that I get deeply immersed in music, as opposed to I'm not interested in other people's problems. So these kinds of questions are able to tap broader personality constructs. And those two questions you saw related to openness to experience, the second one to agreeableness. And there are other personality features that we can characterize across humans, and that includes neuroticism or the degree of anxiety, conscientiousness, and also extroversion. I'm sure you're very familiar with this idea of extroversion, how outgoing people are. So psychologists have many, many, many kinds of tasks in order to assess cognitive function. Marinella Casasola was showing you some of those that are administered to children. In the field of personality psychology, there are hundreds and hundreds of tasks. And in fact, it's one of the jobs of psychologists to devise these kinds of tasks in order to assess behavior and estimate how it varies across populations. And then to determine how reliable these estimates actually are. And finally, another big aspect is to see how these measures of behavior relate to each other. There's a statistical method by which we're able to examine the associations between a wide range of behaviors and see how they relate. Some of them are so obvious, it's kind of shocking that psychologists are actually paid to do this, such as people who are more extroverted tend to say that they have more friends and they feel more socially supported and they're not as lonely. So that's actually one of the large sources of variance in this data set of over 500 people. What we also see is that people who are angry, they tend to be sad and stressed out. Interestingly, they also don't sleep as well. People who are good at solving complicated problems, they also tend to have a broader vocabulary and they're more open to new experiences. And people who report a greater sense of meaning and purpose in life also tend to be happier. So these are the sort of broad collections that we can see across individuals. And we can extract these larger sort of factor scores across many, many kinds of observations of both behavior and personality. An objective in my laboratory is to see how do these behavioral features, how do these individual differences that sort of make us who we are, how do they relate to the brain and the functioning of the brain? Because that's really the interface between our genetics and our body and how ultimately we interact with the world and with who we are. And what we find is that across these 10 behavioral categories, that intelligence is associated with 4 of these large-scale brain systems. So the extent to which these functional ensembles are stable within your brain predicts how well you're able to reason through complex problems, how open you are to new experiences across a number of different measures by which we measure intelligence. What's interesting is that there's variability across these 4 functional systems and how they're represented in cortex. One of the first ones is essentially how lateralized your brain is, how much there's talk within hemispheres, but not as much crosstalk between them. And the regions that are involved here are those classically associated with working memory and the ability to solve complex problems. So potentially it reflects the autonomy of each individual hemisphere. However, there are also other functional ensembles and we can estimate their stability. And for another of these functional networks, it looks as though the opposition between memory and the ability to maintain a mental representation is dissociated from these working memory abilities. So there's regions that are more involved in recollection are dissociated from areas involved in problem solving. And the degree to which they're separated is predictive of intelligence. Also, the extent to which information flow is segregated in the brain is predictive of intelligence as well, following this classic ventral and dorsal streams of information processing, where spatial information is processed more dorsally or goes up into the parietal lobe, and object information is processed in the temporal lobes, in the ventral stream. And it's the stability of these systems, again, that are predicting the intelligence of the subjects. We also found another significant association between prosociality or agreeableness, the extent to which someone is empathic, is associated with this other set of systems, which are grossly characterized as anti-correlated. They're how diametrically opposed these 2 networks are. And there's a lot of variability across subjects, or across our research subjects, who, in terms of how these networks are expressed. And the degree to which this pattern is expressed is predictive of how empathic and prosocial these individuals are. Now, there's a lot of features of human experience and individual differences that we have not been able to relate to the brain yet. And it's unclear as to why that is. So we saw that there are 10 aspects across all of these different individual psychological measures, but it's really not clear how well positive emotion or memory is related to the stability of these systems. And so there's a lot of remaining questions as to, is that because our estimates of the brain aren't good enough? Is it because our estimates of behavior aren't quite reliable or valid enough? And this is where this is an ongoing and evolving field, because we have not come near to explaining what it is about the brain that makes all of us behave differently and think differently. So with this work, I want to thank my postdoc, Dr. Michael Ferguson, who did a lot of these analyses and generated the really beautiful images, as well as the Human Connectome Project, which is an open access data set. You can log into the website and download all this data yourself if you are so inclined. It's about 20 terabytes, so beware.
Can you just comment on where you see the field going for people who are now 17 years old? Like, in other words, when they get to college, what will we be looking at? What extension of what you're doing now do you think will be hot in the next 5 years?
Well, let's see, in the next 5 years? I mean, this kind of work, like looking at the resting oscillations, is this exploding area in neuroscience. And really, these are some of the first studies to link it to individual differences in behavior. And so I think that's going to continue on. I think if there's ever going to be a point where functional neuroimaging is clinically certified, it's going to be looking at the stability of these resting state systems. Because you can predict language areas of the brain, motor areas of the brain, and that's really important when you go in and you're actually removing tissue due to various kinds of cancer. But what I want to say is, how many of you know what a postdoc is? All right, so there's this whole sort of chain of command that happens in academia. So there's about 250,000 people in this country that are going to take the AP exam in psychology. Back when I was in high school, in the early 90s, there was around 4,000. So this is just a dramatic explosion. And of those people, around 100,000 undergraduate degrees issued in the country in 2013. 100,000 of them were psychology degrees. For those folks, after completing those 4 years, there's something called graduate school, where you can get a master's degree or a PhD. So it's anywhere between 1 to 2 years for a master's. Versus 5 to 6 years for a PhD. So of those who have a major in psychology, around 5% of them go on to eventually get a PhD. So there's another tier of training that occurs after that, and that's where the postdoctoral fellowship comes in. So that's another 1 to 4 years where you're trained directly underneath someone. And about 25% of people who get PhDs in psychology go on to do a postdoctoral training, and that's really a research stream. Another 25% go on to clinical internships. And then eventually, you can get a real job in psychology, and that's where either as a clinician or going into academia, and for those who have PhDs, around 35% go into each of those streams. So, which is actually fairly high as a percent. So Michael, my postdoc, he's actually a biomedical engineer. For that stream, it's much more bleak. Only about 8% go on to become a full professor, whereas most of them enter into industry. However, that sort of career path is also really essential because he combines this really amazing ability to reason and decipher patterns from signals that emerge from complex systems. So with that, I'm going to thank you and see if you have any questions.